Welcome back to Bunny Banter, the first and only podcast for everything Killer Bunnies. I'm your host Matt, here with host Mikey, co-host Mikey,
Hello.
and we are honored again to have Joe Slack as a guest.
Honored, holy cow.
Yeah, you're the celebrity here.
Oh my goodness. Got a pretty low budget then.
Well, zero budget is pretty low.
Wait, I'm not getting paid?
Well, maybe, we'll see. What are we talking about today, Mikey?
We are talking about custom cards.
Custom cards. So there's Joe is the expert on custom cards, having made some himself. One of which is in the game. Just a reminder. That's why he's our celebrity. But before we get into that discussion, I have a few things to mention here. The database that we've been using has now been corrected thanks to Glenn from the Magic Care community. So, for example, before we mentioned there's like 18 cards with the yellow ball thread stripe. It's actually 27. So, just
We were called out by Jeff.
yeah, we were called out by Jeff. We knew the database was off, but we weren't sure by how much. So now it's all fixed. All the statistics should be correct from now on. And another thing to announce is that previously we had a competition of sorts. We had a competition to guess what was Jeff's favorite card of all time. And we had one entry that the person deleted after posting. Somebody guessed the Jarnak. Hopefully not to just spite Mikey with his Jarnak PTSD. But the official answer from Jeff was Athena. So nobody guessed Athena, so nobody wins the official Bunny Banter Swiffer Duster today, unfortunately. Sad day, because I was really looking forward to signing that. Make me feel important. So one disclaimer before we get into the custom card discussion. We're going to be looking at the good, bad, and ugly, and we also added decent cards in there as well, of custom cards. So we're going to be talking about what we consider good design and bad design. Nothing against any of the creators of the cards. We've all had terrible ideas before or terrible executions. So there's nothing against the people who made the cards. In fact, Joe made one of the ones we're talking about in the ugly category. So
And it is ugly.
So yeah, we'll be talking about those cards. So let's get started here. For those watching on YouTube, I will have the cards on the video. However, I'll make sure to read each one as we go along here as well, for those on the other podcast services. The first card we're looking at here is Tucker's Treasure, which says allows the player with carrot number 1, so Tucker, to pillage half the discarded dollar from Cabal's market. So if you play this card, it's just a run card and it's aggressive. You get half the dollar from the discard. Joe, let's hear your thoughts on this card first of all.
Well, I mean, if you have just the base set, the blue and the yellow base, that's kind of a fun card. But if you're listening to this podcast, that's unlikely the case. If you're playing, a 40 carat game and you play this on carat 39, yeah, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of sorting through the discard.
How about you, Mikey?
Well, okay. First of all, I wasn't gonna say this, but I was told that it's okay to say this. The bird in the picture has really weird wings. That's it. That was my. I wasn't gonna say anything, but I was told it was from the original Tucker, so I felt it was okay to say that.
Yeah, it's a fun piece of trivia.
Other than that, it depends on when this card is played, but if it's played perhaps maybe halfway through the game, when you have a lot of dollar in the discard pile, that could effectively end the game, so therefore it wouldn't be halfway through the game, it would be at the end of the game, but halfway through the carrots or so. At the very beginning, if there hasn't been a lot of dollar run through, well then he doesn't really do much. But Yeah, and then also there's the issue. Okay, is it half of the dollar cards that are discarded, or do you have to add up all the dollar in the discard pile and then take half of that?
Oh man,
Presumably that mounts.
yeah.
So
If you're making me do math, oh, forget about that.
exactly.
Uh, one thing
So
I'll comment on with this card is I believe this was created back in the good old days when there was only 20 carats compared to our current 54, soon to be 80, relatively
oh
soon. So back in the days of 20 carats, perhaps this card was actually balanced because there wouldn't be a very large amount of dollar in the discard pile.
Hmm.
Maybe 10 carats in, maybe you'd get 3 carats out of the deal, I'd estimate, at
So
most.
what you're saying, this is kind of like one of those vaguely racist Disney cartoons that just doesn't age well. So you can
Something
edit
like
that
that.
comment out if you want, if that's not okay.
You're good. That's interesting analogy, but it almost fits. Is that back in the day, this would have been a fine balanced card, but when we're looking at cards that can be overpowered, it's usually cards that generate a large amount of dollar instantly. And in the current full set, that is exactly what this card does. So
yeah,
you get into a scenario where the game instantly ends, pretty much. In some groups, or in some games, perhaps this won't even be relevant in full set, because I know I've played some full set games where people will be much more conservative with their dollar management strategies, so there actually won't be a large amount of dollar into the discard pile. Which, now that I'm reconsidering that, let's consider for a moment the exploits of, quote unquote exploit, even though it's intended mechanic, of the pink lethal interacting with the metals to basically save the $5. That generates the dollar, recovers the dollar from the discard pile. So often, any full set game with the red or pink lethal, usually the discard pile is empty in many cases. The dollar discard pile. Because that player will just be generating their $5 return, and we'll just take that $5 directly from the discard pile. So maybe it is actually balanced.
Yeah, that's a
well,
good point, actually.
I
yeah, it's either it's OP or it's useless, kind of.
Yeah,
And there's
sort of. Yeah, it all depends on the pink gleeful. So maybe this is our. I mean, we categorized in the ugly cards where we think it's overpowered or toxic. Maybe it's still a bit toxic because certain games it would just be game winning by itself at
Mhm.
instant rate. So maybe it still fits in that category, but it's definitely has some interesting implications behind it that that definitely weren't intended at the creation of the cards. That's something to consider when creating custom cards is how is this going to impact the game in the future, not just now, but now that we're at 54 cards, it's not as important.
Yeah.
Cards design these days would already have that in mind, perhaps. Let's go to the next card in the ugly category. Let's see if I can switch the graphic here. Okay. This one, I think, is definitely in the ugly category. So it's called Cubed. It's a run card that's aggressive. It says roll a six-sided die. So first of all, card design. Full set currently doesn't have any six-sided dice besides the metal dice. And this was created before the metal dice even existed. So that's a bit of sketchy card design there a little bit. But, who doesn't have a six-sided die? More on that later.
I have a
um,
fishbowl of them, actually.
exactly.
I have a problem.
So roll a six-sided die, cube the value. So you raise it to the third power. Take that many carrots from Kabbalah's market, likely ending the game. Casually roll a 6 on this, and it's a choose 216 carrots.
Oh my gosh.
At worst case, it's a choose 1 carrot. At the second to worst case, it's already a choose 8. and it just gets worse from there. The average cases are, choose 27 carats to choose 64 carats. Those are the average results. I think,
So you're pretty much ending the game
yeah, that's
like
why
you
it says
said.
likely ending the game.
Yeah.
Imagine playing this on turn 1.
Oh my god.
I always, joke about well, it's more, it's partially a joke, but, there's a turn 1 combo at the end of the game currently. It's Tivitello's with, you have to have a bunny, and you have to have a triplet, and you have to draw a rank, and then you have to have Tivitello's in your hand, and then you have to get a 20% chance, and then you have to have the relevant amount of, your opponents can't have a relevant amount of dollar, and then you win the game on turn 1. This just does it in one card.
Hmm.
Joe, do you have any thoughts that maybe I haven't?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of issues with this card, and the Gleaming Gold set as a whole, I think it's a fine set, and this is just my opinion, man. But again, don't make me do math. If you're making a card, I don't want to do math. I hate math. Like, and I'm looking at this card. The black die box is filled in. Why? Why am I rolling the black D12 for? We already established that's not what this card is doing. Yeah, this card just has a lot of issues, in addition to being ridiculously OP.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, Mikey?
Well, first of all, the name, that's kind of clever with the whole six-sided die being a cubing thing. Okay, that was neat. Perhaps prophecy strats for the
Prophecy
metals being the only six-sided die and having the gold in the back.
It was part of full-on custom card booster deck that was called the Gold set, so.
Maybe the whole thing was a prophecy. I don't know. But like Joe said, math sucks, and I don't want to do it. So don't make me do it.
I won't remind you then of the current card in full set, 2 Kilo Mockingbird, where you have to multiply it to 2,000.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that's dumb too. But it made it to full set. Okay, so now we know my second least favorite card.
See, that's one of those where you offer to someone gives you a carrot and you discard it.
Yeah, there
We
you go.
don't have to waste our game doing math.
I think in the current edition of the QCC, it has the successful results, and there's like 4. 4 successful results. That's interesting. Again, I think this card was created when there were only 20 carats in the game, but even then, playing this on turn 1, that terrifies me. At that point, you have to, when it was created, you would have had to roll a 3 as a minimum to end the game. Nowadays, you have to roll a 4 as a minimum to end the game. Soon it'll be, once we get to 80 carats, then you can't end the game on turn 1 unless you get a 5. But still, this card would become balanced if we were ever in, how many carats would we need in the game before this becomes balanced, would you say?
Over 200.
Over 200 for sure. Probably around the 500 mark.
There you go. I hope, I'm just going to put it out there. I love Killer Bunnies, but probably don't need 500 cards.
500 carats would be a bit excessive. Take note of that, Jeff. Don't print 500 more carats, please.
You could do 499 would be fine.
80 is plenty.
Yeah.
I like 80, but let's move on
Back
to.
in my day, we could play Killer Bunnies in 24 hours.
That's great. Moving on to Joe's card here in the ugly category.
Oh, I'm cringing.
So we have. Let's just read the name of this card first. It's a run card that's aggressive. It says the ultimate everybody will hate you forever card of Evil Doom with
This
4
is a
exclamation points.
19-year-old me. This is, yeah.
I love how you casually have text over the image of a nuclear mushroom where it says warning not recommended for players who would like to have allies at some point in the game. So there you go, you're
Even
already looking at the passivity meta.
well, that's what even before I knew about the passivity meta, I knew about the passivity meta.
That's right. Passivity meta was just defined within the past year. It existed long before that. So let's read the card text here. Reminder, this is just a run that's aggressive. This can be used once to eliminate every single bunny in the bunny circle, with the exception of the Halo bunny and any bunnies owned by the player of this card. The only way for a bunny to survive is for the owner to give the player of this card a carrot. Mikey, let's start with your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, first of all, I identify with this name here. This is how I used to title my papers in high school. So, yeah, long extended names. But as for the card itself, um, yeah, everybody would probably hate you, especially if they don't have a carrot. Um, I suppose it's kind of reminiscent of a nuclear war, although a nuclear war you would die too, but um, I don't know. It's just OP is pretty much I think probably the worst thing. There's probably more worse things that I'm not thinking of, but yeah.
How about you, Joe?
Yeah, this makes me cringe pretty hard.
Yeah.
So what makes me cringe harder when I look at this card, okay? The very first time I ever met Jeff, I showed him this card and I was like so proud of it.
Oh.
Jeff, look at this cool card I made for your game, and he tried so hard not to tell me it sucked. And he's like,
Feels
"Wow,
bad.
yeah, what you really made something there, huh, Jeff?"
Sounds like a Jeff thing to say.
Youthful Joe was still had hair, didn't want to crush my dreams. Think I only owed like up to the green booster at the time. Yeah.
Now
Wow.
here's the fun part is according to the passivity meta theories, this is technically balanced. Because however, the reason we have it in the ugly cards category is because of how toxic it is. It's technically balanced according to the passivity meta to have a card of this strength. Because everyone will hate you for the rest of the game, as described. However, the most toxic scenario here is if you play it on the last turn, and then feels bad. Let's move on to the next category. We have 3 cards for each
I have
category.
a question about this card before we move on. Okay, so if in this scenario, would you have to give a carrot card for each bunny that you own, or just one to save all your bunnies?
I think that originally, because I made a couple revisions, originally on this one it was 1 carrot per bunny.
Okay.
I think at some point I changed it to 1 carrot per player, and then I just got rid of the whole idea because it was terrible.
Okay.
The text almost implies 1 carrot per bunny because it says for a bunny to survive, it's the owner to give the player a carrot.
That's why I was questioning.
It's slightly unclear, but
Yeah.
it kind of tends to be the case with these custom cards.
And actually, that's a great point. This is another great example of if you're going to make a custom card, make sure the text is clear. Especially with a custom card, you can make your own bunny bits and but I don't know. Just make sure your text is clear enough though that you don't need to.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll get more into that as we move on to the next category here. We have 3 cards per category. The next category we call the bad cards, where they're not necessarily overpowered, but mechanically they don't work very well. So the first card here, oh, let me get my transition. I messed up. There we go. 7 Up. So it's a special. It has the aggressive circle symbol where it means you would have to have a bunny in play to keep it. It says may be saved by a player to give his only bunny 7 extra lives. Must be run through. Mikey, so I didn't put this under the ugly cards category, which is probably surprising for some people. But Mikey, let's start with your thoughts on this.
Okay. So, I mean, if I had this card, I'd be, ooh, this is nice. But some things that I'm seeing, there could be potential problems. The first thing is if you have a bunny that maybe has a rank or a whole bunch of stuff on it that protects it from everything, and then that bunny you can never, pretty much will never die, or will be extremely OP for a very long time. The other thing that I think is interesting, and you mentioned the circle uh, in the little pink box there, saying that you must have a bunny in order to save it. The other thing that I'm thinking of is that also means that you need to once you lose your bunny, uh, it it goes away, but it just keeps your bunny. So I don't know. That was just something that I thought of, and it's probably not a clear thought. Um, and then the other thing is that you have to have only one bunny in order to use this card. So it doesn't mean that you have to have only one bunny in play in order to save it, or can you save it until you have only one bunny, and then it goes into effect. Those are my thoughts.
How about you, Joe?
So on top of that, I'm noticing the pretty huge inconsistency here. It's a special card that must be run through, which is weird. Also, being a special card, can I save it and then play it later? Because technically, if it's a special, couldn't I? But the text implies I couldn't because as soon as I save it, it goes into effect. So mechanically, I feel like this doesn't quite add up. And also, when it says I get 7 extra lives. Now, my interpretation of that is if my bunny is killed, it just stays alive.
Mm-hmm.
I'm already picturing a fist fight of you had 6 lives left. Nuh-uh, that was my 7th life, or vice versa. I don't know. Maybe we just play Killer Bunnies a little too aggressively more than we should. But
Yeah, you both brought up there's 2 points I think I want to bring up. The first is the use of the pink rectangle with the circle. That symbol always refers to mechanics such as the monolith, where if you don't have a bunny, you can't keep it saved. So that kind of answers your question, Joe, where could you play it from the hand? No, because you can't play the monolith from the hand. Could you save it without a bunny? No, because you can't save the monolith without a bunny. So that's the intention of using that symbol. However, the problem is the mechanic of giving your bunnies extra lives is conflicting with that symbol because it brings up the question. Usually with these types of mechanics, the bunny isn't actually the death isn't prevented. The bunny actually dies and then is resurrected is usually how the mechanic works. I'm trying to think of an exception right now, but mechanically that's usually how it works. In that sense, since it has to be your only bunny, if that bunny were to die, then mechanically this card should be discarded.
That's
So
kind of what I was trying to get at and
yeah,
didn't do as well as you did.
yeah,
But yeah.
mechanical consistency forces this card not to exist, which is why I placed it under the bad cards design. But let's ignore that for a second. Let's take the idea that, okay, let's make it just a standard special. Okay. Standard aggressive special. You probably just placed it under the bunny like a bunny modifier thing, something like containment suit. Actually, that doesn't work. That doesn't work either because bunny modifiers are discarded upon death, but ignore that for a second. Let's treat it like insurance purposes. Uh, Keeping track of 7 lives. That's a giant mess. It's just like the scenario that Joe mentioned where, oh, you had 6 lives, not, whatever. It becomes a mess. Besides that, it is, I would say that if the mechanic was better executed, where the mechanical problems didn't exist, I think it would be balanced. I like that he puts that has to be your only bunny because
I agree.
that puts a large enough limitation where this effect could actually be balanced. Balanced in this case meaning not toxic rather than not overpowered, because it's difficult for things to be overpowered in the passivity meta. It's possible for it to be balanced. There is this scary case that Mikey mentioned where maybe you have a ranked bunny with maybe it's something like Puptastics with a rank, something as simple as that,
That's actually
where
what I
all
was
of a
thinking.
sudden, where all of a sudden you have a bunny that can't be targeted by a lot of stuff and you have to kill it 8 times. That's scary, but again, mechanical consistency, that scenario doesn't actually, now that I've thought about that, that scenario doesn't actually exist because as soon as the bunny dies and gets resurrected, the rank is gone. So I think that's actually balanced, but the mechanical problems are what hurt this card.
At least it's nice art, though.
Yeah, I like the theme. It's pretty great.
Now, I think I asked this, but what are your thoughts on, since it says that it has to be your only bunny, so then can you save it when you have more than one bunny and then it just goes into effect when you only have one? Or do you have to wait until you only have one bunny to save it?
It's another ambiguity. Mechanically, you would think that you could save it before you have only one, but I
Mm-hmm.
think the intention is to have only one at all points.
Yeah.
So that would have to be clarified in the bunny bits there, which is another problem. Moving on to the second bad card here, blindfolded. This is this is an interesting one. We have a play immediately. It's a nice change from all these aggressive cards, but we'll see if it's a nice change. Okay, so let's start with the text here. Whenever this card is picked up, so first of all, that's a wording inconsistency, but a minor thing. I don't think of any. What's the actual phrasing that should be?
When the card is drawn?
Yeah, when the card is drawn or when the card is played. I'm trying to think of what Sanders have. I'm just looking up. Actually, it's not even. Let's see. I should look at melding. What's the word of melding? You see, all the play immediatelys that would have, when the card is picked up, that's implied phrase. You look at a card like melding, and it immediately
Yep.
goes into the actual effect. So the phrase when the card is picked up is redundant, but minor thing. That's just a small side issue. When the card is picked up, the player must roll the 4-sided triangular die. How many of us in this discussion have 4-sided triangular dice on
Well,
hand?
you guys got the Conquest Adventure, right? Or did you not get that one?
That has
comes with the
4-sided
G4?
dice in it?
Yeah. No, it
No.
doesn't. No.
I didn't think so.
No, it doesn't.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry.
I would be shocked because that'd be
No, it does not.
too soon, but that would be yet another misprint. The 4-sided triangular die, that's I think that's put in there because I'll get into the actual effect here in a second, but I think that's put in there for balance reasons. That's a good attempt, poor execution, where nobody actually has a 4-sided triangular die. Some people would,
Yeah.
but it's not consistent enough. The number rolled is the number of rounds the player must remain blindfolded. Second question, how many of you have a blindfold on hand when playing Killer Bunnies?
You can use a sock.
I suppose you could. There you go. So it creates another scenario where you have to get creative. Okay, number rolled is the number of rounds the player may remain blindfolded. This includes selecting cards and playing your hand. Those would be the same thing, but okay. You must trust in the other players to read your cards for you during this time. So essentially, you are blindfolded and can't see anything. Is you have to trust your opponents to play everything for you, pretty much. So, Joe, your initial thoughts on this?
Have you guys ever played the game Quelf?
I haven't,
No.
but I've heard of it.
So I mean, you do things like you have to like blindfold yourself and sing the national anthem on one foot, or I don't know, stuff like that.
Huh.
But I feel like a card like this it's fun once, and then it just gets annoying. And I think of what's the card where you got to balance your key, and
B
every
flat.
time, yes, and anytime anyone sees it, we just discard it because it's not worth the hassle for a carrot.
The nice thing about B flat is that you have the option to discard it because it's a run card. This is a play. This is a play immediately.
You don't even get that option, so this is actually worse than B flat.
I actually like B flat.
Oh man, I don't even know you.
Well, you were going to attack Kinder Bunnies last time you guessed it, so I guess we don't know each other. How about you, Mikey? What are your thoughts on blindfolded?
Okay. First of all, this has nothing to do with mechanics or anything, but poor Josh didn't capitalize the T in the second and fourth sentences.
Oh,
His English teacher would be very disappointed in him.
Wow, I didn't even notice that.
But yeah, I think a lot of it's just been touched on already. The fact that not many people have a four-sided triangular die or a blindfold lying around while they're playing this. Also, I feel like the wording of it, despite the grammatical errors, is also kind of vague because it doesn't actually get to the whole point where other people actually play your cards for you until the end. If you just read the first four sentences, you could just draw a card without looking and then float one down, and you could play it like that. But then it gets to the very end when it implies that the other people are going to play for you. And also, the whole trusting your opponents, that's kind of a scary thing, especially when you're playing with aggressive people who might not want to be totally honest with you.
You mean you didn't want to play the antimatter raisins on yourself?
Yeah, exactly.
no, you're putting lucky clovers on your bunny. I know, said it right there.
I mean, you just want to show dominance and play the weapon on yourself. It was the obvious play. I mean, there was no question.
This card is, for the most part, unless you have a very strong ally on your side or playing with a passive player, is pretty much going to ruin you for the next however many turns, possibly for the entire game.
Quite possibly. There'd be, if I was to keep the theme of the card of being blindfolded, I think I would change this card in two ways. First of all, I'd make it a run card to be played on an opponent, because then it's much more within the passivity meta of, oh, this player's been aggressive, let me just blindfold them. The second thing I would change is I would remove the four-sided triangular die and I would just make it 1 round they're blindfolded, or 2 rounds, 1 or 2. Some balanced choices there of why you'd want either or. Probably just 1 because it feels bad to be blindfolded and not being able to see all the excitement happening during the game. But fun fact, I've actually attempted to play starter set blindfolded in 2 different ways, but the complete off topic. It does work, partially.
Okay.
I wouldn't attempt it in full set yet, though. Moving on to the next card here, the last card in the bad category. Now this one, Pawn Blank. was rated the fourth best card in the Magic card community back in 2012. So this one might be controversial, but I have my reasons. So let me read it here. It's a run card, non-aggressive. May be used once by a player to remove the color from any pawn, turning it into a white free agent pawn. And for reference, the card compendium does not clarify further what on earth it means to be a free agent pawn. So Mikey, would you like to set the stage for the thoughts on this card?
Sure. Well, first of all, I feel like I should explain uh, the Omega Pawn to kind of advance this conversation. So Matt and I discovered this thing, and I'm sure some other people probably have, called the Omega Pawn, where you use Ice 9 and Random Paintball Assault to turn your a pawn into any color pawn at all the color pawns at the same time as well. Which effectively allows you to re-roll anything and use all of the P cards and all that fun stuff. And talking beforehand, Matt and I kind of discovered, actually it was Matt, we were just talking, it was Matt who discovered that this could potentially be more OP than the Omega Pawn, but it does have some limitations to it. Because it can only be one color at a time. So instead of having, if you being able to roll all of the or re-roll all of the dice when you're playing a card, you can only re-roll one dice. But it still has the same powers that it has with the P cards and such. So I think I'm going to end there, and we'll move on, and then Matt, you can explain the rest of it.
Yeah, so the Omega Pawn's very interesting. Where Mikey mentioned OP again. Just a reminder, when we're talking OP, it's usually within the context of this mechanic is toxic rather than this mechanic is game breaking. But so the Omega Pawn, created by Ice 9 and Random Paintball Assault, is as though you had every pawn, pretty much, except it's all in one. So it creates a scenario where you could actually get two of every pawn if you were to happen to get every other pawn as well, which is very exciting. And I've seen it happen twice, both of which were recently in Remix actually, because it's much easier to do it there. This mechanic, as Mikey mentioned, is almost exactly the same, and I'll explain why mechanically. Mikey mentioned the rerolls. The P cards, the reason why it works there is because mechanically, if you have that color card, the color pawn that corresponds to the P card, and you play the P card, so now you have another use of it, even if you lose the pawn, mechanically you still have that extra use. So even though the color of the free agent pawn will change, you still have the extra uses. So mechanically, it's almost identical to the Omega pawn. And of course, with triplets, it serves the same functionality as the Omega pawn. Now, the difference is, which makes it scarier. Well, first of all, it only takes one card rather than a two-card combo. That's easily counterable. That's one thing that makes it spookier. Second thing, which is more impactful, is that the Omega Pawn is extremely easy to steal because it is literally all of the colors. So you could steal it with any card like Athena. Pawn Thief guarantees to steal it because it will automatically be the highest color because it's every color. Bunny Shop Quartet is almost guaranteed to steal it. You also have Pawn Recall to worry about, Pawn Star, much more. All of those anti-pawn cards that will deal with the Omega Pawn very effectively. A lot of those, almost all of those, are irrelevant against the free agent pawn. Because just like you can't use Athena to steal a free agent bunny, because the bunny can just switch away from green at instant speed, you can't use it to steal a free agent pawn. So all of a sudden, somebody plays Pawn Thief. Pawn Thief, unless every result is the highest, with Ice 9 or something. It's a cool combo, Ice 9 Pawn Thief. I should try it sometime. Steal all of the pawns, except brown. Anyways, I went off on a tangent there. Pawn Thief, basically, for all practical purposes, cannot steal the free agent pawn, because if it happens to roll the highest, you should switch the color of the free agent pawn. So all of a sudden, you have an Omega pawn without a lot of the downsides, with this slightly less upside of you don't get the extra rerolls, but the extra rerolls usually aren't relevant anyways. Joe, any thoughts on that?
I really thought this was a fine card until you brought my whole world crashing down.
I imagine I just did the same for everyone who experienced this card in its golden age of Magic Carrot back in 2012. Like I mentioned, it was the 4th highest rated card out of all the cards there. And I just crushed everyone's dreams. So sorry about that. It's still completely within the passivity meta and its balance. It's just extremely toxic.
Yeah.
If you play Pawn Blank, everyone should target you because you have a very big threat there. Okay, now we get into the decent cards category. So this category was dedicated to cards that would have been excellent design, but just missing on just a small point, essentially. So first card here, the Giant Bunny. It's a run card, of course, it's a bunny. It's a green lumbering bunny that steps on any weapon or roaming red card directed toward the player having in the bunny circle. The Giant Bunny requires twice as much food as a normal bunny. So Joe, let's start with your thoughts on this.
So I like that it has the balance built right in, that it requires double feed the bunny. Even though you could argue, and this would happen in my game, that water is not food, therefore it does not have to take double water.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, the reason, though, I wanted to bring this card up, though, is specifically, though, what does steps on any weapon or roaming red run card directed toward the player mean? So does that mean if you attack one of my other bunnies, it doesn't get attacked ever? Does that mean, I don't know, like, it's redirected? It feels a little vague to me. If that does mean literally none of my other bunnies can ever be attacked, including this bunny, except by a feed the bunny, that does seem kind of overpowered, maybe a little. I don't know. It's just kind of my thoughts on that.
How about your thoughts, Mikey?
Well, that's a good thing. I never thought of that. Yeah, does it, like, especially with a roaming red, does it stop the roaming red, or does it just protect it, or protect your one bunny, all your bunnies? I'm just pretty much repeating what Joe said, but
Just means you're a smart man.
yeah.
I suppose great minds think alike. And here I am about to repeat the same thing. So I think this is one of those cases where the theme has overtaken the mechanics a bit. So steps on is obviously thematically using those words. I assume it means it stops the weapon or roaming red, which is arguably a bit toxic. Who knows? You'd actually have to test it to find out. I mean, it's kind of like we can make a comparison to Brundle Bunny, except it's instead of not being able to target it with weapons himself, he stops all weapons and roaming reds from targeting it altogether. So in that sense, I think there's some vagueness with what steps on actually means, and I think I looked up in the compendium. That doesn't clarify either. Certainly, it was close. You had the balance there. You had the theme. The theme worked out. Steps on, if that implies negation, that's fairly toxic. But the same could be said about law enforcement bunnies in full set right now, so sometimes toxic bunnies are okay. At the very least, this effect is more so toxic defensively rather than the offensive toxicity of something like the free agent pawn, where all of a sudden it's generating all this free value for you. While the giant bunny is just like, oh, you can't play weapons on me. You can play weapons over there, that's fine, but
Yeah.
which maybe that's scary. You know, we
That
have
would
to.
be interesting to see how this worked with the Trojan bunny. Would
Presumably
it
it would
like
negate
that?
Trojan Bunny as soon as it's played rather than when it explodes. So if Trojan Bunny was played first, then
Mm,
presumably the Giant Bunny couldn't stop it at that point. That's interesting
yeah.
to think about. Uh, Lots of interesting clarifications that will never be answered.
Oh, great.
Besides, outside of mechanical consistency, they'll never be officially clarified. I had a thought. Oh yeah. So within the passivity meta, if this card was played, I would value it as high at its current state. I'd value it as high as the pink lethal,
Mhm.
which we all know how much the pink lethal gets targeted. So I'd
Yep.
imagine as soon as this is played, people would be using all of their Feed the Bunny cards to kill it because uh, if they're the one who kills it, well, if it's killed, it's available for repurchase. So that's
Yep.
huge. That's the idea. So it is balanced, more or less, but
Yeah.
it's definitely a bit spooky. Just a higher value card. Aggressive players would love it.
Yeah.
Next card here in the decent category. I actually really like this design. Calvin Ball. It's a run card that's aggressive, and it says highest roll is the rule change. So you're rolling the 6 dice, and some rule is going to change. Note that if the highest amount is on more than 1 dice, more than one rule is changed. So if you play this with Ice 9, all the rules take place. So let's take a look at some of the rules here. On Violet, pawns can no longer be used. Another anti-pawn card, that's exciting. On Orange, take one free weapon card per turn.
Ooh.
Uh, I wonder, I know this was clarified on previous Bunny Banter, but the phrasing of take a weapon card, does that imply launching, or does that imply adding it to your hand?
Good question.
Hmm.
Hmm. Then you also have what happens when you run out of weapon cards. Do they just get recycled?
Well, yeah, because I believe if we're going to be mechanically consistent, I don't think this was the intention, but take should be launched immediately to be mechanically consistent with free weapon. So in that
Yep.
case, the weapons wouldn't run out in the discard pile. However, if we were to ask the person who created this, I would assume that they would have meant add it to the hand.
Yep.
That seems like the more reasonable outcome rather than
Yeah.
launching antimatter raisins every turn.
Ooh.
Moving on. The green results, only 2 cabbage cards allowed at a time. So that's interesting. This was created before the existence of Forever Cabbage, which makes
Mhm.
Forever Cabbage even stronger. Yellow, this one's really interesting. Only 2 bunny cards down allowed at a time. I assume that means per player. It doesn't say, but
Oh,
we're going to
Oh,
assume for the sake of balance that means 2 bunnies per player. Which I assume same goes for the cabbage or water because 2 bunnies total. Oh, well, now we're actually in ugly card territory, but it must mean per player. Uh, Blue is only 2 water cards allowed at a time, and black is rerolls are no longer used. So lots of different very unique design here. Obviously, thematically referencing Calvin Ball from Calvin and Hobbes. Mikey, your thoughts on it?
I don't think it's a terrible card. I think that really you touched on the biggest issues with it, which is, you know, just clarification really. I need two bunnies per person or two bunnies in the entire circle. And then, when you launch the weapons, you pretty much touched on anything at least that I can see. They did for They're not quite consistent on their grammar, but I'll let that go.
Now, I know Joe has another issue with this card, which
I
is why
do.
it's in the decent category. Go ahead, Joe.
My issue with this card is that there is no end condition.
Oh, I
So if
see.
you play this card on round 2, that means the rest of the game you can only have 2 bunnies per person. That is going to be a heckin' long game.
Or
And
adding a free weapon card to your hand every turn.
yeah, and I know there are other cards with no end condition, like protein resequencer. That is a hard word to say. Protein resequencer, or Mikey, plug your ears, the Dejarnek. Uh, but I would say Jeff knows what he's doing when he throws those cards in. When we're
Mhm.
making fan-made cards, I think we need to be a lot more careful about that.
Yeah.
Protein resequencer you could counter by just discarding the special because it's one of those specials that as long as it's saved the effect takes place. Kind of like Minolith but without the requiring a bunny part. Um, the Jarnak is it the only scenario I can think of right now that can't be countered? I'm trying to think. Is there any other card in the game that has no end condition unconditionally?
But protein resequencer, you wouldn't get rid of, though, right? Because there'd be no benefit to you.
Well, I mean, if someone else discarded it with
Oh, gotcha, because
leg
it's a
take.
safe special. I
Yeah.
getcha.
Yep. So that has the weakness of just being a special, so it could be easily stolen or discarded. I think the Jarnak is the only card that has
I know
literally no end condition that I can
you
think of
can
right now.
temporarily stop it by dropping a barrier on top of it.
The barrier mechanic was removed at the release of Chocolate.
Oh, it was.
It was.
Man, I'm outdated.
It's canonical these days that the Jarnak has literally no negation. 'Cause that's what the
Huh.
bunny bits
That's
have.
a terrible thing. It's like, Jeff, you need to fix that.
I'm going to have the counter. I'm going to make the counter argument here. It's only a terrible thing in the 2 and 3 player cases. 4 players,
So,
it's actually within value threat, or within the passivity meta, because it's just forcing quote unquote alliance between 2 players. The other 2 players could also form more or less an alliance. Now, of course, that's the case with that Mikey was just about to bring up, where one player is stopped by the conch and missing 18 of their turns, but that's a 3-player case at that point. So, I actually, having an end condition is safer because we don't actually know how impactful this card is. We can assume a lot of these abilities would be fine for the whole game. Having only 2 cabbage cards, that's fine.
Yeah.
Feels bad if you get the 0 and the negative and the 1/2, but you actually it's within the rules to discard the 0, so the 1/2 and the 1, that feels pretty bad. But things like only 2 bunnies down, that's a scary one. And take 1 free weapon card per turn, that's a scary one. Imagine if you got those 2 together, and then all of a sudden, oh, you can only have 2 bunnies, and everyone's gaining a weapon card every turn. Even if we're assuming the weapon's added to the hand and not the mechanically consistent, the weapon's played immediately. That's it could be scary. I really like this design. I think the theme is amazing, but an end condition would be nice.
yep.
My suggestion to change it would probably be as simple as making it a special that requires a bunny at all times.
Agreed.
Mhm.
That's the safest change to do something like this. Let's see, I think we have one more card in the good category. Or
Yeah.
the decent category, that's the ones we're in. Decent. I said good category because the card here is Good Karma. It's a run
Ooh.
card that's aggressive. And the text reads, forces all players to give their next associated card, for example, Heavenly Halo and Lucky Clover, to the player of this card. Um, this one, the problem I have with it, there's two problems I have with it. First of all, the artwork, which you can see on the YouTube, is a negative of bad karma, which makes sense thematically, but it's confusing that the top left circle is not the correct color for run, and the pink box is now a green box. So that just mechanically it doesn't quite. It's not a huge thing, but mechanically it's not good. The other problem I have with it is the next associated card. In the compendium, it clarifies that their next modifier card. So any bunny modifiers. Thoughts on this one, Joe?
I think you hit the nail on the head with my issues. I wish they would have put a little more effort into how it looks. I also have to mention the dice boxes. They shouldn't all be black. That just bothers me a little bit.
I didn't
But
even notice that one.
it shouldn't bother me, but it does. But mechanically, I like this card a lot.
It's interesting now, of course this was created a while ago, back in 2009, but now we actually have some negative modifiers, or at least more negative not modifiers with Funky Fungus, ever since
Oh yeah.
Fantastic Boosters. It's not intended, but by the mechanics of this card, those actually uh, kind of like, yeah, it's interesting. Mikey, your thoughts?
Um, the biggest issue I have with this isn't good karma, because good karma would be you doing something good and then receiving something good back, where you're playing this card, which is something bad towards the other players, and receiving something good. So I think it was poorly named. Um, and then what was touched on about the whole associated card and how vague that is. But yeah.
Here's a mechanical question I didn't think of. Would this card be considered having the yellow ball with red stripe? Because here it's a blue ball with blue stripe.
Ooh.
Probably not.
Oh man, that's another fist fight in my game.
Same goes for Jupiter. I mean, it can't be, right?
It is not a yellow ball with a red stripe.
Exactly, and
That
that's
is
not
my rule
Jupiter.
against a rules lawyer.
There you go. Mechanically, it cannot be, but some would argue it, so that's always fun. Now we get to finally get into the cards that we declared excellent card design, the good category. First card, Pirates Who Won't Do Anything.
Oh, I love this card.
This card is interesting. It actually doesn't have a card type, which more on that in a second here. The card texts say, we are the pirates who don't do anything. We should stay at home and lie around. If you ask us to do anything, we'll just tell you we don't do anything. Obviously, the VeggieTales reference. Mikey,
You
your
didn't
thoughts on this
say
card?
You should have sang it. It's
I
too
thought
bad.
about it.
Oh, oh, I think it's neat. I like the reference. It brings me back to my childhood. I like that it doesn't do anything. It effectively, if you draw that, if since it's not a run card, it just stays in your hand, and it's not good for you, but it's good for the other people. It limits the amount of options that you have, because I suppose it doesn't really. The only thing that I can think of is it doesn't say that you can't discard it. So could you discard it then? And
Well,
then
it's literally a card of no type, so it literally can't be played. Is the idea.
yeah. So I don't know. It's neat. I think it's beneficial to everyone but you, but it makes you happy because it's got the VeggieTales characters on it. So.
How about you, Joe?
So, this is hands down my favorite fan card. Like, I love this card. I think it's such a clever use of the mechanics. Uh, the first time everyone plays this card, they try to run it through, right? So they flip it over. I'm like, what are you doing? That's not a run card. And they're like, how do you play it? I'm like, what do you mean play it? Right? It is now a thing in our card. They're like, "Hey, I want to be your friend. I'm just gonna trade you, okay? But I'll trade you back a card. Just here, sight unseen. Here, just take this garbage card. Never take the card. 100% chance it is this one, right? And then you're stuck with it until you get something that lets you discard your hand.
Yeah, you brought up a point there, which is the one problem I have with this card, which actually can't be fixed and without ruining the card. And I like the card the way it is, but that's that currently in full set Killer Bunnies, I always say it's a fundamental rule that anything that is not run special or very special is played immediately. With this card, I can't say that rule because this card has no type, which is interesting because I'm conflicted. Mechanically, I'd want this to be a run card that does nothing, because then they could waste a turn running it through and still, it sort of keeps the theme, the mechanic, but not really. But I really like this card that it can't even be run through, but there's no good way to fit that in mechanically is the sad thing. Strategically, this card has excellent value in that it has literally negative value. Because if you have any cards like Pass It Along or Melding, or any of those cards where you're swapping cards from the hand, you just give them this card, and all of a sudden they're at a big disadvantage with having less options. So I really like this card. I wish I could fit it in mechanically more with the rules, but there isn't a great way to do it that I can think of, so I think it's a great card. Second good card here. This was one I picked. It's very special, non-aggressive. It's called At Last. A nice picture of a polar bear with one of the penguins. It says, may be used once by a player to immediately counteract any card played by an opponent with a penguin in the picture. Joe, your thoughts on this card?
I really like it because so many have the penguin, right? And it was building up to the game Psychic Penguins, which, as far as I know, has as of yet not materialized. So this feels like a card that should actually exist in the game. So I completely agree with you. I like this card a lot.
How about you, Mikey?
Yeah, I think it's neat. Um, there's not much more to say. It's a good card.
Yeah, it's a very simple one, which is sometimes a great thing, and I really liked it specifically because right now there is no card that interacts with the penguins on any of the Killer Bunnies cards, and there's quite a few that have penguins. We just passed one that Bad Karma has a penguin on it. So it just creates some very interesting scenarios, I think.
Well, wouldn't Pup-Tastics indirectly work with the penguins? Because then you can't play a penguin card on that bunny because
Good
it has an
point.
animal on
Yep, I forgot about Pup-Tastics temporarily.
it.
So there we go. We have one card relevance with the penguins, and now I'm obliged to make a list of cards that have penguins on them, so I can find out what affects Pup-Tastics. But realistically, there's so many things that don't affect Pup-Tastics already that the penguins might not actually make that much of a difference, strictly speaking. Bad Karma doesn't target Pup-Tastics anyways, so who knows? There might be a card that's relevant. I'll find out eventually. Okay, we got one more card here. I think this is a really exciting one. Unnatural Selection. It's a run card, non-aggressive. Allows a player to place the top 10 cards from the draw pile face up individually on the table. During their turn, each player must choose any of the remaining face-up cards as their replacement card until all 10 are gone. The idea is instead of drawing a card, you get a choice out of the ones that are left out of the 10, until of course the 10 are gone, and then you're back to drawing as normal. Thoughts on this mechanic, Mikey?
Well, first of all, before I talk about the mechanic, I want to talk about the art on the card itself. I think that it's neat because first of all, it's a Simpsons reference. There you have the PowerPoint in the back, power plant in the nuclear. Goodness gracious, it's a nuclear power plant from Springfield. And then the bunny, I like that because it's a reference to Mr. Burns' fish with the 3 eyes. And out of all of the cards that we looked at today, this one is the one that took the reference and turned it into a bunny, which I think is neat. The person who did the artwork was very smart. As for the mechanic, I think it's a neat mechanic that they got going on here. First of all, it's beneficial to the opponents watching because you can see what that person has. So you might be picking, there might be a pretty good card out there that you can take, but it helps your opponents because they can know what you have and potentially, what deck it came from, and therefore look out for when you put that card down so that they can prepare to defend themselves against it or attack it. But so that's how it's beneficial, I think, for your opponents. For yourself, it can be beneficial in that it allows you to, you have a choice. If you're the first person, you have a choice of 10 cards that you can choose from. And you might get some pretty good cards in there. The bad thing is if perhaps all 10 of the cards are not very good cards, or, if you're the last person to go through and pick, then you potentially could get a not very good card because I would assume that the last card that is drawn is going to be one that's not very good. So it leaves a lot up to chance, but it also can be beneficial and kind of fun.
How about you, Joe?
I really like it. I like it a lot. I like I've never actually had this happen, but in my imagination, if I'm seeing the cards that are up there and picking from them, I might not pick the card I necessarily want because I want to try to force my opponents to take a card that I really don't want. Maybe trying to plan ahead a little bit. I also really think it's neat if you go on Board Game Geek, I think it is, you can see an older version of this card where mechanically it was pretty different and it was not as good. I think it was like you're just randomly drawing cards and playing them, and it's not very useful. So the designer of this card really took a lot of time here to work on the mechanics and really made kind of a useful, fun card.
Fun fact, this was in the same rating system I mentioned previously with the other one. Unnatural Selection was rated #1 card on Magic Carrot.
Nice.
I think this is an excellent example of every once in a while in the custom cards community we have a gold star perfect card design that just almost looks like it's a real card. I really like this one because it rewards players that are paying attention, where for the next 10 cards you'll know exactly what each player is drawing, so you can do a little bit of hand tracking there. Also, if you see a card that's beneficial for your opponent, maybe you take that first, even if there's a card more beneficial to yourself. Maybe take a simple example. There's a bunny that completes an opponent's triplet. Maybe you take it rather than taking your own bunny that completes your own triplet. It creates a lot of interesting strategic scenarios that reward players who are paying attention, and that's always pretty exciting. So that was our last card. Any closing thoughts before I get into a few announcements?
If you're making a custom card, Please be sure to use correct grammar and punctuation, and capitalize the first letters of your sentences, please. Thank you.
And the correct gradients on the backs of the cards.
There you go.
Okay, so I have a few announcements. Let's hope I didn't forget anything. So for those interested more in the custom card community, the Discord channel has gotten some interest in the custom card community. There have been a few active users, not so many active artists. So if you are an artist and looking to design some custom cards, then there is an opportunity there. Then also I'd like to mention that the Sandbox Gaming Killer Bunnies Bunny Box Storage Solution, the Kickstarter, is up for, I had the amount of days. Let's see, it ends the 19th of August. So by the time the next Bunny Banter comes out, it will be gone. So about a bit over a week from the release of this Bunny Banter. So make sure to go check out that Kickstarter if you haven't already. I will put a link in the description. It is a storage solution for the full set of Killer Bunnies with several amazing features. So thank you, Joe, for joining us today. If anyone has any topic suggestions or would like to be potential future guests, let me know. You can put anything in the comment section, or you can contact me on email or the Discord. Anything you'd like to say as a closing, Mikey?
Jeff bless.
Jeff, bless.
Jeff bless.